You've built an entire philosophy on what sounds like the most obvious statement in the world. A is A. A thing is what it is. And yet you treated that like it was the most dangerous idea you could possibly put in front of people. Why?
Because the history of human suffering, personal, political, civilizational, is largely the history of people trying to escape that fact. A is not a logical technicality. It is a declaration that existence is not subject to negotiation, that reality does not adjust to your wishes, your fears, your ideology, or your vote. And the moment a person, or a culture, begins to act as though it does, the consequences begin accumulating, quietly, patiently, until they cannot be ignored.
You've said it directly. You can avoid reality, but you cannot avoid the consequences of avoiding reality. Most people hear that and think, yes, obviously. But you're describing something much more active than people realise, aren't you?
Evasion is not passive. That is the first thing to understand. It is not simply failing to notice something. It is the active choice not to think, to look away at the precise moment when looking is required. The man who does not open the letter from the bank. The woman who will not ask the question she already knows the answer to. The leader who stops measuring results because the results contradict the plan. In each case, reality does not disappear, it compounds. And the longer the evasion, the higher the cost when reality finally presents itself, and it always does. There are no evil thoughts except one, the refusal to think.
Hold on. The refusal to think as the only evil thought. That's a strong claim. Because most people who are avoiding something aren't thinking of it as evil. They think they're protecting themselves.
And that is precisely what makes it dangerous. The man who lies to himself does not experience it as lying. He experiences it as managing, as coping, as being practical. But observe what he has done. He has surrendered his primary tool, his mind, at the moment when he needed it most. And from that surrender, everything else follows. Bad decisions built on false premises, relationships conducted on terms that do not correspond to what is actually happening. The hardest thing to explain is the glaringly evident, which everybody has decided not to see.
You grew up watching this at civilizational scale, Soviet Russia. That's where A equals A stopped being philosophy and became something almost physical for you.
I was a child when I watched an entire civilization attempt to rewrite reality by decree. Individual merit abolished by declaration. Private property non-existent by declaration. And the architects of that system were not, in many cases, stupid men. Some were brilliant. But they had committed the foundational error. They believed that if the collective will was strong enough, if the cause was noble enough, reality would cooperate. It did not. The famine came, the terror came, the destruction came, first of those who resisted, then of those who had built the system themselves. A is A. A policy built on a false premise produces false results, regardless of the sincerity of those who implemented it.
And you see that same mechanism, not just in Soviet Russia, but anywhere people decide the idea matters more than the outcome.
Everywhere, in every era. And the personal version is the same structure as the political version. A man who is slowly destroying his health tells himself he will change after this project, after this season, after some indefinite future moment. A woman stays in a situation she knows is wrong because confronting it would require her to act, and acting would require her to decide, and deciding would require her to know what she actually wants. Rationalization is a process of not perceiving reality, but of attempting to make reality fit one's emotions. the sequence is inverted, and reality, being what it is, does not accommodate the inversion. It simply waits.
I want to ask about something connected to this, because you argued that rational self-interest is a virtue, that selfishness is good. And I think that's where a lot of people stop listening, because the word alone feels like a justification for not caring about anyone else.
That reaction is the result of a package deal, a word deliberately loaded with a meaning it does not have. When I speak of rational self-interest, I do not mean the man who cheats, who takes what is not his, who tramples others to get what he wants. That is not self-interest. That is the behavior of a man who has no self, who derives his sense of worth entirely from what he can extract from others. And isn't that the root of every despicable action? Not selfishness, but precisely the absence of a self. To say, "I love you," one must first know how to say the I.
That line from The Fountainhead, to say I love you, one must first know how to say the I. That reframes what selfishness even means. But what about self-sacrifice? Because most people would say that's not just acceptable, it's noble. A parent for a child, a soldier for his country. You're saying those things are wrong.
I am saying, look more carefully at what is actually happening in those examples. A parent who protects a child is not sacrificing a higher value for a lower one. The child is among the highest values of that person's life. That is not self-sacrifice. That is integrity, acting in accordance with what you genuinely love. What I oppose is the moral doctrine that your life is automatically owed to others by virtue of their need. That the mere fact someone suffers creates a claim on your existence. That doctrine produces guilt in the productive and entitlement in the dependent. It does not produce flourishing. It produces resentment dressed as virtue.
So the line for you is, are you acting from your own genuine values, or are you acting from obligation imposed from outside?
Precisely. A man without a self has nothing to give. He has only needs and performances. Love is our response to our highest values. It can be nothing else. And you cannot respond to values if you have evaded the question of what your values actually are. Which is why evasion is not merely an intellectual error. It corrupts everything downstream: your work, your relationships, your capacity to engage with reality at all.
I want to ask something more personal. You lived this philosophy, and some of the stories around the people closest to you are painful. Did your life reflect your ideals?
No, and I would be violating my first principle if I claimed otherwise. A is A. I was capable of great precision about ideas, and at times of failures in how I treated people. I do not evade that. What I reject is the inference some critics draw, that personal failures discredit a philosophy. Newton had moral failings. That does not affect the validity of his physics. You engage the argument on its terms.
Is there anything you came to understand differently? Anything you'd hold more gently?
I underestimated fear. I assumed that when someone refused a clear argument, the cause was always evasion, the active choice not to think, and sometimes it is. But I came to understand that sometimes the wall between a person and reality is not cynicism. It is terror. A person who has organized their entire sense of meaning around something they cannot afford to examine. That does not make them right, but it makes the problem different than I sometimes described it. The gap between knowing and acting is not always moral cowardice. Sometimes it is something more complicated, and I might have spoken to that with more precision.
Ayn Rand. Thank you.
A is A. Existence exists. These are not comfortable ideas. They are load-bearing ones. Everything you build, everything you value, every person you love, It all rests on your willingness to see what is actually there. That willingness is not a small thing. It may be the central thing.
Real quick, if you saw our Alice in Wonderland episode, I mentioned Ayn Rand was coming in April. We've moved to a weekly schedule since then, which reshuffled the whole lineup. She's here now, first Saturday of May. Worth the wait, I think. Next week we sit down with Plato. If you thought today was a lot, just wait. Subscribe so you don't miss it, and if this conversation made you think, leave a like. It actually helps more than you'd expect.